Good morning. We're going to continue our journey through 2 Corinthians. Today we'll be looking at 2 Corinthians chapter 10. And just kind of to get up to speed, we had just gotten past a large section where Paul defended his ministry, and then there was some instruction that we reread about a collection that he had taken for the members of the church in Jerusalem that was headed up by James the Just, the church there, where poverty was a really big problem, and there was a significant offering that was taken through the churches with the aid of Titus to help the people in Jerusalem. And so we're going to move into another phase, and what we're really doing is we're going back into a defense of Paul's ministry. So in studying the life of Paul, it certainly seems that there is nowhere that the apostle met with more opposition than he did with the believers at the church of Corinth. He appeared to have many enemies there. And let's keep in mind that the enemies, we get kind of a picture of the enemies being competing ministers, people who believed they had the apostolic mantle, who probably didn't, but thought they did. So they effectively, as we see in our world today, thought a good way to bring him to build themselves up was to bring him down. The thing is that no one should find it strange that Paul was not only met opposition from people who could really fairly be his enemies, but also opposition from those who were wolves in sheep's clothing. So a lot of these apostles, or so-called self-designated apostles, were literally the wolves in sheep's clothing that were going in among members of the church and sowing discord. And that was more effectively done to bring down Paul's stature. So we'll take a look at the scripture. We're reading in the New King James, and I'll do a little bit of reading out of an old paraphrase that I used. But he says, and starting in verse 1 of chapter 10, he says, "Now I, Paul, myself am pleading with you by the meekness and gentleness of Christ, who in presence am lowly among you, but being absent am bold toward you." And we can kind of see that in his letters, his boldness when he's not in their presence. "But I beg you that when I am present, I may not be bold with that confidence by which I intend to be bold against some who think of us as if we walked according to the flesh." Age-old battle, this flesh and the spirit. "For though we walk in the flesh, and we do live in the flesh, we do not war according to the flesh." And this will sound familiar to you. "For the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but mighty in God for the pulling down of strongholds, casting down arguments, and every high thing that exalts itself against the knowledge of God, bringing every thought into captivity to the obedience of Christ." That's a key. If that's the only thing you get in our time together, it's the idea of bringing every thought into captivity to the obedience of Christ and being ready to punish all disobedience when your obedience is fulfilled. So Paul went out of his way to be above board, blameless, and he argued for his integrity, and we have seen that through both of the letters to the Corinthians that we have. There was other letters, as we mentioned before, at least one other letter that we do not have that was lost to history. But in these two letters, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, we call them, he argued for his integrity, and he made himself as accessible as possible. But he still had to deal with people who envied him and wished him well. And we are really thinking, the scholars believe anyway, that those that wished him ill was out of envy, because it was clear to many people that God had given Paul this specific calling in this apostolic mantle. And others who may have actually even been there during the time of Christ saw the death and burial and resurrection of Jesus, but yet we're not called in the same way that Paul and the other apostles, Peter and the like, were actually called to ministry. And they did what they could do to lessen his authority. So again, we see him attempting to vindicate himself, and we see that a lot. That's kind of a really predominant theme in this book. And we can see his mild manner and humility of how he addresses the Corinthians. He says, I'm pleading with you. I like the Phillips translation, J.B. Phillips, where it says, now I'm going to appeal to you personally by the gentleness and sympathy of Christ himself. Yes, I, Paul, the one who is humble enough in our presence, but outspoken when away from us, and begging you to make it unnecessary for me to be outspoken and stern in your presence. We talked about how that the letter that is lost to history was harsh. It was a letter about discipline. It was a letter about addressing somebody who undercut Paul's authority, and kind of a condemnation or instruction to the people of the church in Corinth who didn't stand up for Paul, didn't defend his ministry, even though they had benefited significantly from it. So Paul's just saying, please don't give me a reason to be harsh. I don't choose to be harsh. People had wrongly accused Paul of walking according to the flesh. And we talked about that with that offering. He had to be above the board, had to face accusations that he was skimming money or that he was doing it to somehow benefit himself. People had wrongly accused him of this, and he was repeatedly, and he's just kind of echoing back. We see in Micah, the book of Micah 6:8, that says, he has shown you, O mortal, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? To act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with God. So Paul's really saying, I don't have any desire to be harsh. For though we walk in the flesh, we do not war according to the flesh. So he's telling them the very simple truth that we really could grasp today, that even in the things that we're seeing around us, and the turmoil and upheaval we're seeing, the battle is spiritual. And you can't address a spiritual battle with temporal weapons. It doesn't take care of the core problem. We have to fight with spiritual weapons. And likewise, the work of ministry is like warfare. We can forget that in our desire to be accepted and relevant in our culture, who is increasingly regarding us as unnecessary or even troublesome. It's a conflict between the life-giving gospel of Jesus Christ and the power of the world and the one who controls the world. Satan's strongholds, which we see around us, the only way they can be torn down is by the gospel. Contrary to what some popular teaching that we're hearing these days is that, we're as it is in heaven. And that will come when Jesus reigns on the earth. But right now we know that the earth is in control of Satan. It's under his control. And the weapons that we use to fight for the gospel and the disciplines of the church are not outward force. They're spiritual weapons to address a spiritual battle. So we just kind of take a look at some of the things. Paul says, going back, he says, now I beseech you. And here in the Phillips said, I'm going to appeal to you personally by the gentleness and sympathy of Christ himself. He is asking the people of the church, please do not give me any occasion to have to correct. Kind of showing a father's heart there in a way where he really doesn't have a desire to bring people into correction. He'd rather keep them in between the buoy, so to speak. And he talks about himself. He says, in verse 1, he says, I'm base among you. The word here usually means low or humble or poor, but here it means timid, modest, the opposite of boldness. Now, Paul is kind of known for his boldness. Such was formerly the meaning of the English word base. It applied to those who are of lower degree or rank, humble birth, and it kind of stood opposed to those people who had an elevated rank or dignity. What he really meant here to say is they regarded him as timid and afraid to execute the punishment which he had threatened, which was probably not wise. and that manifesting a spirit which was the opposite of boldness. This was doubtless a charge which they brought against him. And we kind of see it kind of brought up again to where he was bold in his writing, but he was timid in his presence, or even the words that they were kind of harsh, that he was, maybe even not a very gifted speaker. The tone of his voice was not good, but that was a constant criticism. So through the whole thing, he reminds us, he says, please act in a way where I don't have to exercise severity. I don't want there to be a reckoning. And he says, as if we walked, in verse 2, he says, as if we lived or acted. The word walk in the scriptures is often used to talk about a course or manner of life. And that's really what he's encouraging, is that righteousness and the understanding of a spiritual battle be the normal course of life. So I want to talk a little bit more about, and we'll encounter it in verse 3, where he talks about, for though we walk in the flesh, that's not where the battle is. He says, the truth is that although of course we lead normal human lives, the battle we are fighting is on the spiritual level. And this is the Phillips translation. Paraphrase. The very weapons we use are not those of human warfare, but powerful in God's warfare for the destruction of the enemy's strongholds. Our battle is to bring down every deceptive fantasy and every imposing defense that men erect against the true knowledge of God. And again, that's what we're getting to. That's a constant theme with Paul through a lot of his writing, is it's reconciliation. It's the sacrifice of Jesus Christ on the cross for the sole purpose of reconciling God's creation to God. That's what he wanted. He provided the way for us to be reconciled to God without having to go through an onerous animal sacrifice process that was at best temporary and at worst gruesome. We have this understanding that Paul wants us to understand that our battle is not in our bodies, in our flesh, it's in the spiritual realm. And it's a warfare with corrupt desires and sensual propensities of our heart. Our hearts are not pure. I hear a lot, and I've heard a lot, especially in some psychology classes and where I work, that people are generally good. And no, people are generally not good. We're the result of a fallen humanity, and we need Jesus Christ. We need the salvation to reaffirm the goodness. So we look at all the different kinds of sin that Paul would be addressing. Would be idolatry, sensuality, corruption, intemperance, profaneness, and fight those wherever they exist. So then he goes, and we've talked a little bit about the weapons, and so he says it goes down to the pulling of strongholds. Strongholds means a fastness or fortress, strong fortification. And this is a big issue. This is a very big objective and a difficult thing to do. But he ties that again right in verse 5 to the casting down of imagination, reasoning or opinions. The Greek philosophers valued themselves, especially on their ethical systems, in which their reasoning appeared to be very profound and conclusive, but they were obliged to assume principles that either didn't exist or were false in themselves. And we kind of see that creeping into the kind of humanist philosophy that we deal with today. So going through this, it's all about restoring us to the knowledge of God, bringing into captivity every thought. That's something I've been kind of contemplating lately, is that how I think really determines where my heart is. If I find my mind wandering to things that are not of God or not holy, not even acceptable to God, I need to bring that back. That's that part of that spiritual warfare, bringing it back into line with how Jesus would desire that I live my life. And that fits into with being obedient to Christ. It's a process. It's not something that I'm going to arrive at and say, okay, it's Friday. July 10th, now all of a sudden I have my thoughts captive. It's a continual process. And that provides us to be in our sense of readiness. And Paul talks about this where he's ready to punish all disobedience as he should do as an apostle. And that clothed as he is with the power of being an apostle, he's aiming to subdue all things to Christ. He's not trying to correct for his own purposes. He's not trying to correct for his expectations. He wants his ministry to prepare people to be ready for Christ. And he talks about when obedience is fulfilled. He said, delicately intimating that the reason why it was not done was not the church's problem. It wasn't the church that caused the problem. It was bringing your mind and your thoughts into a kind of a state of discipline. And if you didn't do that, I need to reinforce that discipline with the members of the church. It seems kind of an unpopular thing to talk about today. But the church was to deal with the enemies of the Redeemer. And that's really what it comes down to, is you're on God's side or you're not. And the church is really to do that spiritual battle against people who are against Jesus Christ, and to show the entire readiness and to sustain the apostles. And Paul was, as an apostle, was wanting us to have the same dedication and the same promise of salvation that he had. So with that, this next week we'll move on to verse 7. But I just would encourage you that in all the tumult and things you see around us, is to concentrate, spend your time, and prayerfully try to bring your thoughts into, what glorifies God? What in my life can I do that would help focus on Jesus? And I can guarantee you that when you focus more on Jesus, and I'm working on this myself, the things that come out of your mouth will be more edifying, and the other people around you will notice. And that's really our goal. That's what we want to do, is reach others for Christ. Father God, I just pray that everyone who heard this word and is in the sound of my voice would just be blessed, Lord, that your word in the Bible would touch them. And I just pray that you would spark a heart, an ear and a heart that would be attentive to what you'd have to say and carry your message forward, not mine. And we ask it in your name. Amen.